All right, so this is our first chapter. It's going to be mainly on terminology and kind of getting acquainted with some different aspects of anatomy. So these will be things, terms that you will use throughout the semester. Okay, so there's going to be some memorization involved here, which is, never anyone's favorite thing. But I would highly recommend making flashcards and that kind of thing, because you will see a lot of these terms over and over again as we go through Anatomy and Physiology 1. Okay, so your time will not be wasted if you really study the terms that we're going to go through, especially when we get to these regional terminology. There's going to be a lot of terms there, but you'll see them over and over and again, and I'll kind of point that out when we go through that. Okay, so obviously this is Anatomy and Physiology 1. So the first things we should do is define the terms anatomy and physiology, because those are the two things we're going to be studying as they relate to the human body. Okay, so anatomy is going to relate to structure. All right, so anatomy is going to be structure when we look at different organ systems like the cardiovascular system, and we look at the heart, and we talk about the different chambers in the heart and the different valves in the heart. Even when we talk about the histology of the heart, so that'll be the different tissues that make up the wall of the heart, all that is going to be structural. Okay, so what makes up these different organ systems, what are the components, the different organs, what tissues make them up, that's all structure. And then we have physiology, which is going to be function. Okay, and so function is going to be how does that organ work. All right, so we're talking about the heart as an example. How does the heart actually pump, right? How do those cardiac muscle cells talk to each other? How is that electrical signal sent through the heart, right? How does the blood move through those different chambers? How does the pressure change as they move through the chambers? All right, so that would all be examples of physiology. Okay, and obviously the heart will be next semester. All right, we're not going to get into the heart for Anatomy and Physiology 1. Okay, and so one important thing to always keep in mind is that structure determines function. All right, so the structure of the heart, the reason we study it, and it's really important to understand it, and the chambers of the heart, the tissues of the heart, the valves, where they're located, how they work, right, is because that structure is going to determine how the heart functions and how it's able to function. And then when there's problems in the heart, right, it's not functioning properly, you need to understand that structure in order to be able to understand what's going wrong and be able to intervene. Okay, so it's really important to understand both things and that they are intertwined, right? They're related to each other. Okay, so that's anatomy and physiology, structure and function. A lot of structural stuff, especially in A&P2 when you get to it, is going to be covered in lab. Okay, so structure in the anatomy is a very lab-related concept. With the bones, for example, this semester, and the muscles, locating the different bones and bone markings is something you'll do in lab. We'll spend a little bit of time on it here in lecture, but primarily that's going to be a lab thing. Okay, and then we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the physiology and how things work with the bones. For example, we'll talk about how bones grow, where they come from, all right, how they're modified, the different tissues involved. If a bone breaks, how is it repaired, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's structure and function. All right, so with all living things, right, they are built on different levels of organization. So we start with very small components and we build those together to make a complete organism. So let's take a second and talk about the levels of organization for the human body. So we talk about the smallest level of organization, right? That would be here. This would be an atom. So specifically, this would be oxygen. And actually, this level of organization is really going to be how we approach anatomy and physiology. So after this chapter, our next chapter is going to be on chemistry. So we'll talk about these atoms and these molecules, which is the next category that it'll make. And then we'll build that together and talk about cells. And then we'll talk about tissues and organ systems. Okay, so we're going to kind of work our way through these levels of organization. So atoms would be the smallest. All right, so we have an oxygen here, right? You could have carbon, sodium, calcium, chloride, any of those. If we put a bunch of different atoms together, we make what's called a molecule. Okay, so this molecule here would be glucose. You can make lots of different, right? H2O would be another one, water, carbon dioxide would be another one. And we'll talk about a lot of those in the next chapter. Different molecules, we put them all together to form kind of the structural components within a cell. That is called an organelle. Okay, so for example, this organelle here is a mitochondria. Okay, and so it's also important for you to know some examples of each of these. That way, if I ask you, glucose would fall under which level of organization, you could tell me that it's a molecule. Or a nucleus in a cell falls under which level of organization, you could say, well, that's an organelle, right? Because it's within a cell. Okay? So then our next level of organization, we have a bunch of organelles working together to form cells. All right. So for example, this would be a white blood cell. All right. You could also have red blood cells. You could have skin cells. We'll give them specific names, right, when we get to tissues. You could have neurons, which are types of nerve cells. You could have muscle cells. Right? You have lots and lots of varieties of different kinds of cells that do different functions in the body. Okay? And so if you have many of the same type of cell working together, that is called a tissue. Okay? And so this example here would actually be what's called an epithelial tissue, right? That would just be, for example, like your skin, right, is an epithelial tissue. These are just tissues that cover surfaces, okay? So this would be an epithelial tissue. You could have muscle tissue. You could have cardiac tissue, which would be in the heart. This particular type of epithelial tissue would line the digestive tract and that sort of thing, okay? So it's the same type of cell, right? These are all, tall little column-shaped cells working together. Then if you have multiple types of tissues working together, that forms an organ. I'm sure you guys could name a lot of different types of organs. Obviously here we have the heart. You could name the liver, the stomach, the kidney, right? The large intestine, the small intestine, the brain. You could go on and on and on with different organs that I'm sure you know. Okay? Then if we have multiple different organs working together, like let's say we have the stomach working with the esophagus, working with the liver, working with the small intestine, that would form an organ system. Okay? So the great thing about recognizing an organ system is their names all have the word system in it. Okay, and so you actually will need to know, I would advise you, and I think it's going to be in your chapter review, right, is to go through your textbook and look at the different organ systems, kind of familiarize yourself with it. I mean, we have like the cardiovascular system, respiratory system, nervous system, skeletal system, muscular system, urinary system, lots of systems. And you should kind of be familiar with a few organs from each system. Okay, so you do that independently, go through your textbook. It shouldn't take long. A lot of it should be familiar. Maybe there's some systems like the lymphatic system you're not super familiar with. And so just look over that and review those. Okay? So we have organ systems. If we put all of those organ systems together, that gives us an organism. All right, so that would be us, right? Humans would be the organism. Okay, so again, on the test, I could ask you in any format I want, right? I could say, give me an example of a molecule, and you would name one. Or give me an example of a cell, and you would name one. Or I could do the opposite. I could say, let's see. I could say the heart is an example of what, right? And you would say organ. Or the spinal cord is an example of what? That's actually an organ, right? So if you put the spinal cord together with the brain, right, and all of the nerves that come off of it, that would be an organ system, right? That would be the nervous system. Obviously, if I said nervous system, right, that would be an organ system. If I said humans, right, that would be an organism. If I said red blood cells, that would be a type of cell. All right, I would pick something, especially when we get down here to like tissues and cells, I would try to pick something that would be pretty obvious. Okay. All right, so those are the levels of organization. Now let's dive into this regional terminology. So I'm not going to sit here because that would be an incredibly boring video, right? I'm not going to sit here and go through every single regional term that is on your list that you need to know and point them out on these pictures, okay? It is a long list, and some of them are very logical, and I'm sure you can already kind of associate them with the region they're talking about. But first, before we talk about these terms, let's go over anatomical position. Anatomical position is key to talking about different parts of the body in anatomy and physiology. And so we always assume that when we're referring to a part of the body, that person is standing in an anatomical position. So that means that they are indeed standing. All right, so they're erect, standing. They have their arms down at their sides. Right, they're facing forward. So just like this guy here. And then your hands, your palms are forward. And your feet are forward. That is anatomical position. Okay? And then that way we can easily know that we're all referring to the same thing. Okay? Especially when we talk about like limbs, right? It would be easy to be talking about, you know, part of a limb, and you don't know if it's here or if that limb is, you know, up here, right? You don't know if that hand is facing palm forward or if you have it facing palm backwards, unless you can assume that it's an anatomical position. Okay, so anatomical position is very important when we're discussing different regions and different parts of the body. So we can all just assume that the body is in this exact position. Okay? It gives us all the same reference point to be working from. All right, so let's go through some of those regional terms. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the ones that I think are a little more challenging, and then I'm also going to go through a couple that I think are good examples of why it's so important for you to study these regional terms. So let's talk about that first. Why do you want to study this long list of regional terms and understand what they mean? Okay, so the example I like to use for that, and there's actually a few we can use, right? But the one we're going to use here is going to be for this region, right? This is called the brachial region. Okay, so brachial just refers to your upper arm. Now remember, these are regional terms, okay? So we're talking about kind of, it would almost be more of a shaded area than just an arrow, right? So this would be the brachial region, and it would include the front part here too. Okay, so the brachial region, right? And so with the brachial region, if you know that, when we go to next semester study the blood vessels, you have a brachial artery. So you're in lab, you're looking at the list of the arteries you need to know, you see brachial artery, you can think, oh, okay, well that makes sense. I know at least where to start looking for that, right? That would probably be in the brachial region. Also, when we do muscles this semester, and you're in lab looking at the muscles, there is a muscle called the brachioradialis muscle. All right, and so you see that on your list of muscles you need to know. You're thinking, where the heck is that muscle even going to be? Brachial, for brachioradialis, tells you that it's probably going to be, at least part of it, it's going to be on that brachial region. All right, so it actually goes from the brachial region down to the radius. Okay, so that gives you an idea of where to look. And that's true with a lot of these terms. So another one that's really good, let me see if this color is easier to see a little bit, okay, is axillary. Yeah, I'm just double checking that it's on your list. Yeah, axillary just refers to armpit, okay? So the axillary region is the armpit region. You have an axillary nerve, you have an axillary artery, all right, that would go through the armpit, okay? So that's why it's so important. You're going to see it over and over again, even when we do like the bones, right? So the region on the lower back of your skull is called the occipital region. All right, so the occipital region is kind of this, if I were, again, you know, it's not just a point, it's a region, so I would shade it in. It would be kind of this lower back of the skull here. That also would correspond to the occipital bone, would be located there. When we look at the brain, the occipital lobe would be located there. All right, so these regions are gonna help you in the future. Okay, you're not learning them, you know, just to give you busy work to do. They actually are extremely helpful. Some of them are going to seem very weird, right? So let's go through some of those that might seem kind of, you know, strange, right? Terms like facial and cranial, you can probably figure out. Umbilical, you can figure out. Let's talk about, I'm just kind of glancing over the list and seeing which ones, you know, I always see you guys struggle with. Okay, so here's one. I'm going to write here. Antebrachial. All right, so actually, if you know brachial already, you know that it's probably going to be somewhere on the arm. Okay, and so the antebrachial region is going to be actually the forearm. Okay, so here, right? So again, if I were to highlight that region, it would be this whole forearm here, right, front and back. So antebrachial. And then we have a word that kind of goes with it, which is antecubital. All right, and so that is actually going to be this little, it's kind of like the crease of your elbow, right? So antecubital is this part, just the crease of your elbow. So it's only on the front, right? It doesn't wrap around the back for this one. So antecubital is the crease on the kind of the front of your elbow. And that is because on the back of your elbow, right, that region is called, where you would actually just point to where your elbow is called the olecranon region, okay? Or olecranol, depending on where you look. I'll put that because that's what's on your list, all right? So that's the elbow, okay? Femoral, I'm sure you guys can, you know where the femur is, so that's your thigh. Femoral would be the thigh region. Let's look through. So, and I think your textbook and your lab book have a weird definition for this word. All right, so the hallux. I think your textbook and your lab manual say that the definition for hallux is the great toe, and a lot of people wonder what the heck the great toe is. That's just your big toe. All right, so the hallux is your big toe, and we also give a special name to the thumb, which is the pollex. Okay, so the thumb and the big toe get special names. The other digits are just called phalanges, right, whether they're toes or fingers. Or the digital region, right, also refers to fingers. Okay. So this is one peroneal, right? And it kind of has two names that you could see it by. All right. And I emphasize the O because there's another term that is perineal with an I. All right, so the peroneal is also sometimes referred to as the fibular region, okay? And so it actually refers to the side of your calf, all right? So if I were to kind of color in the region, it would just be the outside here of your calf, okay? And that actually, so fibular kind of corresponds to the bone that runs here on the outside of your leg called the fibula. Okay, so that makes sense. And then I also remember O in this term, right? So peroneal, I think of the outside of the leg, O for outside. Because the other term, perineal or perineal, and it's not easy to point to on this picture just because of the way the picture is arranged, is the region between the external genitalia and the anus, right? That's the perineal region. And so I always remember that because it has an I, right? So I think I would be more internal, right? And that's a little, that's why it's hard to point to on this picture because it's a little more internal than this picture is showing. Right, so peroneal is the outside of the calf. Perineal is a little more inside. It's the region between the external genitalia and the anus. Okay. I think a lot of the others are pretty straightforward. So sural is a term you probably never heard of, but it's pretty straightforward. It just refers to the calf, right? So that whole calf region. Crural would be kind of the opposite. It would refer to like your shins, so the front of your leg. Okay, so go through your list of terms. I would make note cards, right, with these different terms and their definitions on the other side. But I would also, especially if you're like me, I'm very visual. I prefer even a picture, you know, like this where I can point to things. I would recommend doing that. So I posted for you, right, in the section for this chapter, just a picture like this, right, that's blank. So you can, if you want to, print it and label it and use that to practice. One tip I actually always give students that I love for lab and even for something like this for lecture is if you take this and you print it and you buy some of those like clear plastic like page protector sheets that you can slide that printed picture into, you can actually use dry erase markers and you can label the structures and you could practice that way and then erase it, right, and keep going. Okay, so you could potentially print this picture like this, point to, you know, different regions, go ahead and make some lines pointing to different regions like this, and then slide that page into the page protector and just use a dry erase marker and label these different things. And then you can erase it and keep practicing until you've got it all down. I love doing that, especially in lab where you can print, you know, pictures of the different lab models and stuff like that and make your kind of own study guide. Okay, and that would be great for this too. All right, good. So those are your regional terms. Study them early. They will help you throughout both semesters of A&P. Okay, so now let's talk about life functions. All right, so these are just the different functions of the human body that are necessary for life. All right, thus the name life functions. Okay. All right, so with the different life functions, we'll just kind of briefly go through and give some examples. So one function of life is going to be to provide movement. All right, so the body has to be able to move in order to be able to interact with its environment. All right, so that is one major function of movement as a life function. So interact with the environment. All right, and so that would be accomplished by obviously the muscular system working with the skeletal system, right? So if we didn't have a skeleton giving kind of, that rigid support, the muscles wouldn't, contracting wouldn't really mean anything. So your skeleton, your bones working with your muscles together provide movement, and then, the nervous system would help to control that movement. Then there is metabolism. So this is just your body converting nutrients, right? The things you eat, you consume, into energy. All right, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about it a lot with the digestive system in A&P2. We'll touch on it a little bit for our class. Excretion is a major important function of the human body. That's just the way of removing waste products. Okay, we know that the body can grow, right? Obviously, we start out as, infants and grow into adults. So that is the process of growth. And so that would involve also development, developing different skills like speech and walking and that kind of thing as we grow. The body is also responsive. So responsiveness is a function for life, all right? And that allows us to detect changes in the environment. All right, and that's really important because we need to be able to adapt to our environment. So if we detect a change, like it's really hot outside, we need to be able to regulate the body temperature to adapt to that change in the environment, that heat or cold, right? That kind of thing. So we need to be able to detect and interact with our environment. If we encounter some sort of painful stimulus in the environment, we need to be able to detect that pain and respond to it, okay? Detect changes in the environment and react to them, all right? And then we know the body can digest things, so that is just breaking down and extracting nutrients. Whoops. Okay. And then we have reproduction. So we know all living things, that's a characteristic of something that is alive, is that it can reproduce. All right, and so that's really important for continuing the species. So you're going to pass on your genetic information to your offspring. Okay. And then maintaining boundaries is really important as well. So you have a distinct internal environment versus your external environment. All right, and you need to keep those separate. So that would be a function of the skin, right? So the skin is going to distinguish the internal environment from the external environment. Okay, so these are life functions that are performed by the human body. And so a lot of times when we go through our different organ systems, we'll kind of point out different functions of those systems that relate to these life functions. Okay. Now let's talk directional terms. So these, again, more terms, kind of like our regional terms. These are essential. We're going to use them all the time. when referring to locations of different structures in the body and different tissues and organs and that kind of thing. Okay, so directional terms. All right, so let's start with, we'll kind of start off easy with some things you probably heard, okay? So we have inferior, all right, and we have, whoops, come on, there we go. All right, superior, okay? And so an important thing to keep in mind with these directional terms is they're always going to be comparing two things to each other, right? So they're going to be relative. So you wouldn't say the umbilical region, right? So that would be the belly button. You wouldn't say the umbilical region is superior. I mean, okay, to what, right? Not necessarily. If you're talking about to the pectoral region, it's not superior to the pectoral region. But if you said the umbilical region is superior to the, we talked about the crural region, right? So here, that's correct, right? But you always need to be relating two things to each other, right? So these terms, these directional terms are relative. Something is superior to something else or inferior to something else. All right, and so superior would just mean that something, is above, all right, and inferior would mean something is below, okay? So superior, inferior, above and below. And so some other terms you may have heard before are going to be anterior. Sorry, my voice is going out. All right, anterior and posterior. Okay, so anterior just means towards the front, right? Posterior means towards the back. And there are additional words that mean the same thing. So you may hear ventral, which means the same as anterior, all right, towards the front or towards the belly. And posterior would be dorsal, all right, towards the back. So those mean the same thing, all right? So anterior, posterior, ventral, dorsal, both refer to either the front or the back. All right, so let's go to some that kind of may be a little less familiar. All right, so we have medial versus lateral. Okay, so medial is going to mean towards the midline. All right, and so if we took like a little line and we drew it down the middle of our guy here, all right, so medial is going to refer to closer to the middle. Okay, so you could say that the nose is medial to the eye, all right, that would be correct. Okay, and so then lateral would mean further away from midline. Okay, so you could actually kind of reverse it and you could say the eye is lateral to the nose, all right, or the ear is lateral to the eye. Okay, so it's further away from midline than the eye is. All right, so that's medial and lateral. And then, okay, so the next terms can be very confusing, all right, and so I'm going to tell you, we're going to define them and I'll tell you when you should use them, okay? So proximal, all right, and distal. Okay, so proximal means that something is closer to the trunk of the body, right? So this is closer to the trunk. Okay, and so distal means further from the trunk. All right. sounds pretty straightforward, okay? And so when you would use this is with the limbs, all right? So you use proximal and distal when you're referring to the arms or the legs. Okay, so the trunk of the body, just so we're clear, right? So this would be the trunk of the body right here. Okay, so when we're talking about the arms, proximal would be closer to the trunk, distal would be further away, all right? And so for the legs, proximal closer to the trunk, distal further away. Okay, and so when we're referring to kind of relative parts of the arms or the legs, it is more accurate to use proximal and distal than it is to use superior and inferior. All right, so let me kind of give an example. So you can say the palm of the hand, right? If we're comparing the palm of the hand to our antecubital region, right? That crease of the elbow. You could, if I asked you to compare those two, so the palm is blank relative to the crease of the elbow, you might look at this and think kind of automatically the palm is inferior because it's below that crease of the elbow. All right, so while it might be correct to say that the palm is inferior to the crease of the elbow, all right, it is not as accurate as it is to say that the palm, right, is distal to the elbow. It's further away from the trunk than the elbow. And so that just eliminates the possibility that perhaps the arm is right straight up in the air. So then the palm is no longer inferior to the crease of the elbow, it's now superior. But it's still, if we're using proximal and distal, is true. So it's still further away, distal, from the trunk relative to the crease of the elbow. So when you're talking about the limbs, the arms and the legs, it's more proper to use proximal and distal when you're comparing different regions. Okay, so always keep that in mind. All right, so proximal and distal are for the limbs, the arms and the legs, and they're more accurate. Okay, and so then our last two terms are pretty simple, right? We have superficial and deep. Whoa, those letters all blurred together. There we go. All right, so superficial and deep. So superficial just would mean closer to the surface, right? So the skin would be superficial to the muscle. Okay, and so deep would be further from the surface. Okay, so you could say the stomach is deep relative to the skin. That would make sense. All right, so superficial, closer to the surface, deep, further away from the surface. Okay, so these are the directional terms. Make sure you understand them and you can use them. Your homework and your chapter review gives you some kind of practice with that. So practice using those, be able to fill in kind of blanks like I was giving examples for. All right, so I could ask you the carpal region, right? That's going to be the wrist, is blank relative to the coxal region, which is the side of the hip. All right, so the carpal region is blank relative to the coxal region. So the carpal region is lateral, further away from midline than the coxal region. Okay? All right, so practice those, and then we'll pick up on the rest of this chapter in the next video.